I'm a scientist, and when we try to look at something, we try to quantify it, we try to rank it in terms of levels, give a numerical scale. But when you look at consciousness, you realize that there are over 20,000 papers written on it by theologians and ministers and psychologists. Never in the history of science have so many devoted so much to produce so little. And so being a physicist, I said, well, how would a physicist approach a solar system, an atom? First, we describe the electron in space. That's the first thing we do. Try to understand planets and motions in terms of space. Then we try to understand their relationship to other electrons, other planets, stars, for example, creating solar systems. And then stage 3, we go forward in time, and we make predictions about the future behavior of planets going around stars. And so when you apply the same methodology to consciousness, you realize that there really are 3 stages of consciousness. Consciousness that understands our position in space, consciousness which understands our position with respect to other people, emotions, social hierarchy, politeness, etiquette, and third, predicting the future. And so I say that there are 3 levels of consciousness. Now, I give a definition of consciousness, something which eludes some of the greatest philosophical works, I think. I read a number of treatises on consciousness, and they never define it. I give a definition in 1 sentence, and that is, consciousness is the process of creating multiple feedback loops to create a model of yourself in space with regards to others and in time in order to satisfy certain goals. Alligators, for example, would be at stage 1. At level 1, they understand their position in space with regards to prey. The back of our brain, for example, is the most ancient part of our brain, the reptilian brain. No, way the back of the brain, the medulla, the cerebellum, balance, for example, in a car accident. You would sustain injury here, your sense of balance is thrown out, territoriality, hunger. Then the center part of the brain develops when you're an adolescent. That's the monkey brain, the brain of social hierarchies. That's when children have to learn politeness. That's when they have to learn social etiquette and the social hierarchy and control their emotions. And then the last part of the brain to develop is the front, the prefrontal cortex, and that is the thinking brain, and that differentiates us from the animals. Animals have level 1 consciousness. They understand their position in space. Monkeys have level 2. That is, they understand their relationship to other monkeys. But only humans have level 3 consciousness, which is understanding tomorrow, the future. We daydream, we scheme, we plan. Animals don't do that. It's all instinctual for animals. And then a scientist says, well, this scale is very nice, but what is your unit? Your unit of consciousness. My 1 unit of consciousness is a thermostat. 1 feedback loop that allows you to monitor the temperature in a room, because it senses its position with regards to temperature. A flower may have 10 or so, because it has to monitor temperature, humidity, water, sunlight, so on and so forth. And then by the time you hit a reptile, maybe 100 different kinds of feedback loops. By the time you go to a mouse, perhaps thousands of feedback loops. And then we, as humans, we're the only ones who see tomorrow. If you have a pet, like a dog or a cat, you can teach it many tricks except understanding tomorrow.
So then, where would you put numerically our consciousness? And how exactly do you get to that number? Because you're talking about measuring consciousness, and you mentioned those 20,000 papers. Most of them, or many of them, say you cannot really measure consciousness. You cannot even identify, some of them say, the brain structure that it's associated with, arguably. What would you want to say about that?
I think we can rank up the scale and measure the consciousness of anything, even robots, even extraterrestrial intelligence, animals, dogs, cats, and pets, on the number of feedback loops. For example, a thermostat would have 1 unit, a flower would have 10 units, but think of a crocodile. Crocodile has multiple feedback loops because it has to understand its position in space and then its prey, understand the behavior of the prey. And by the time you go to monkeys, it's even much larger. Monkeys have to understand emotions. They have to read body language. They have to understand their position in a social hierarchy, coalitions, who's your friend, who's your enemy. Things that are very, very complex are involved in monkeys. By the time you reach a human, the total number of feedback loops involved in predicting the future is enormous.
Yeah, I understand that, but my concern here is that we kept kind of a relative scale. So human relative to a monkey, monkey relative to alligator, alligator relative to a flower.
Right.
But do we get an absolute measurement? Because, I mean, isn't that what science is all about, to have a mathematically precise, exact number in the end of the day?
Right. So in other words, I would give a test to a human to rank their level of consciousness. It's not an IQ exam. That's the first thing you think of an IQ exam. But when you follow people with high IQs over 20, 30 years, you find a lot of marginal people, petty criminals, people on the margins of society. IQ tests do not strongly correlate with success in life. However, there is one characteristic.
Criminals.
However, when you look at a criminal, you realize that safecrackers, even though they may have low IQs because they flunked grade school, they may understand the future of a bank robbery much better than the police.
Exactly.
They can outwit the police because they can dream up scenarios more realistically than the police can. So here's my, quote, IQ test, and that is to put people in strange environments and have them calculate realistic scenarios. Now, the Air Force understood this. Long time ago, the Air Force gave IQ exams and found that they were not very useful for understanding how good pilots are in war. They gave them another test. Let's say you're stranded behind enemy lines. Calculate the total number of escape plans that you can devise. And they found that people who have, quote, low IQs were very good at seeing the future. And people with high IQs did not necessarily see many escape plans like the others. And that's what I'm saying. The number of realistic scenarios you can compute for a given situation, being stranded on an island, of being stranded behind enemy lines, robbing a bank, that correlates to me much better with our level of consciousness than an IQ exam. And again, all of this is measurable. We can put this on a scale, including robots. If my scale is correct, then even robots can be ranked by consciousness. I would say that robots are at level 1. They understand their position in space. They have the intelligence of a cockroach. Asimo, one of the most world's advanced robots, I interviewed the creator of Asimo, and he admitted that, Asimo has insect-like intelligence. That's an exact quote from the developer of one of the most advanced robots on the planet Earth. Now, at MIT, they're trying to develop some emotional robots. That would be the beginning of level 2, and maybe even a little bit of level 3, because robots can predict the future in one dimension. They can predict, for example, airflow on an airplane wing, but that's about it. We can predict the future in multiple scales. Throw somebody on a deserted island, let them survive, put them behind enemy lines. All of a sudden, you realize you have to have a full complex of common sense notions about space, time, and other people in order to escape behind enemy lines.
So I want to come back to the topic of robots in a little bit later, but for now, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the brain on the one hand and consciousness? How does it arise in the brain, where exactly, and how's that whole process work?
Well, historically, we had something called dualism, where the spirit, the soul, was different from the body. Then in the last 50 years, we had a little bit of neuroscience. We began to realize that the brain is wetware. Wetware that runs software called the mind. So we began a unified theory so that the mind is software running on the wetware of the brain. But now we have the next level of evolution, and that is the connectome. President Barack Obama and the European Union want to dump $1 billion to create the connectome, a map of all the neural circuitry of the human mind. So one day we'll have two discs. We'll have a genome and a connectome. One which has a map of the genes of our body, and the other one, all the neural pathways of the mind, which contains emotions, memories, sensations. And in some sense, we're going back hundreds of years into the past. We are now separating the body from the mind by having the genome and the connectome. And realize that when you die, in some sense, the connectome and the genome live on. And of course, does that mean that you are immortal? Well, to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it depends on how you define you. If you are nothing but wetware running software, then when you die, hey, that's it. Sorry about that, folks. You're gone. But if your connectome and your genome survive, in some sense, a part of you live forever.
I'd like to stay away from the Clinton-esque definitions on my show, generally speaking, but they're very funny, I admit. Now, so tell us a little bit more about what your take is on, for example, the hammer of Penrose theory of quantum consciousness. Because there are many ideas about what consciousness is, how it arises, where. One of them is actually a colleague of yours, Sir Roger Penrose, very famous physicist, together with Dr. Stuart Hameroff, whom I previously interviewed on this show. So their theory is kind of very controversial and ostracized generally in the field. In fact, during my Global Future 2045 conference, I was kind of surprised to see Ray Kurzweil, who is generally a very sort of even person, kind of come up very strongly against the theory and saying, we know that's wrong, straight out. So what do you think and what do you make of that model?
Well, Penrose, of course, is a very well-known, well-established physicist at Oxford University. I think he's onto something, but perhaps there's less than meets the eye. First of all, the question is a computer deterministic? That is, once you push the button, the outcome is known perfectly. The answer is yes. A computer is nothing but a bunch of transistors. You push the on button, and you get an output. The other question is the human brain deterministic? Exactly. Are we programmed, or do we have free will?
Exactly.
And that goes to the whole question of philosophy, religion. Are you responsible if you are a mass murderer? Why do we put people in jail? Why do we punish people? Our entire society rests on the question of free will. If we are a bunch of transistors, then there is no free will. So in some sense, I disagree with the hardcore determinists who say that we are nothing but a bunch of transistors masquerading as neurons that is totally deterministic, that one day we can model with a machine. I think that we do have some degree of free will. However, the free will is different from the free will of Penrose and other individuals that have written about the subject. For example, if I have a motion picture of a Hollywood movie, everything is deterministic. I know the beginning, I know the end. People in the movie could say, I have free will. I am the master of my destiny. But we know we hit the play button. And the play button means that everything is scripted, meaning that this conversation is scripted.
Yes.
That means that the outcome of this conversation is also scripted. I don't believe in that for several reasons. First of all, there is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
Yeah.
If I have two Earths and create them 4.5 billion years ago and then run the play button, 4.5 billion years later, if I have twin Earths, will they both evolve humans? And the answer is probably no.
Not necessarily.
Probably no, because of Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So quantum mechanics does play a certain role in the human mind. Now, if you take a look at trying to model a neuron, realize that neurons are leaky. They're messy. They're not digital. They're not just on and off. Sometimes they leak. They have all sorts of deficiencies. Neurons are not totally deterministic. And I think that the narrower a neuron is, the more leakage you get. And these are quantum mechanical effects. So I disagree with Penrose into thinking that that's why we cannot build a robot with human-like intelligence. I believe that we will, one day, create robots with near human-like intelligence that are indistinguishable from humans, passing the Turing test. So I would disagree with my colleague, Roger Penrose. I believe that we will one day have a robot that can pass the Turing test. However, I also believe that there are quantum effects. Otherwise, we are totally deterministic.
In the brain, you mean?
In the brain. Neurons leak. They have quantum mechanical effects that manifest at the ion level because, of course, you have the transport of ions across neurons that enable it to fire. These are small effects. So for the most part, the brain looks deterministic. But I think ultimately there is free will. Ultimately, we are masters of our destiny.
You know, there's so many fascinating things that you said there that I'm going to start grabbing one by one, a few of them. But first of all, let's stay with free will for a second, because I'm a philosopher, and that's a very important topic to me.
Right.
But also, I want to push you a little bit more, because some of the most famous physicists in the history of physics, from Newton to Einstein, were hardcore determinists.
Right.
And you kind of break away seriously with that tradition in you're saying that we do have free will. How do you feel about that, staying against names like Newton and Einstein?
Well, first of all, the universe is not deterministic because, sad to say, Newton and Einstein were wrong on this question. We have quantum mechanics, which is the most successful theory of all. It's successful to 1 part in 10 billion, making it the single most successful theory of all time. However, it is based on uncertainty, meaning that things cannot be totally deterministic. So this conversation, the end of this conversation cannot be totally determined. We are not actors acting in a film that is already made and is being shown in a Hollywood movie theater by simply hitting the play button. That's not the way reality works. And so I think there are quantum effects. However, I don't think they're huge. Some people think that because of quantum effects, we have free will just like the ancients imagined. I don't think so. I think to a large degree, you can't predict the future behavior of the brain. And when some criminal says, it's not my fault, my brain made me do it, I say that, well, in some sense, yes. In some sense, criminals are blameless. I still think we should put them in jail and throw away the key for some of them because they're dangerous people. I think there are dangerous people that should be locked up perhaps for the rest of their life. But is it their fault? No. Because in some sense, their brain is largely deterministic, and it means that it's true, their brain made me do it. Their brain is defective. For example, you can brain scan people who are serial murderers and pathological killers. Some of them, you can see that their nucleus accumbens, their pleasure center, lights up when they see images of people being tortured. They love the idea of torturing other people. But does that mean you put them in jail? Only if they commit a crime. Once they commit a crime, you put them in jail. Are they at fault? No, I don't think so, because the word fault is a human word that has no scientific justification. Blame, fault. These are words that humans have used to describe other people's behavior they don't like, even when they're, quote, not at fault because their brain made them do it.
You know, that's very fascinating, and that kind of connects with my next question on the brain here, which is in two parts. The first part is, do you think that the brain is properly a classical computer then in that sense?
No, it's not a Turing machine. The Turing machine, you have inputs, outputs, and a program that massages the inputs. However, the brain has no windows. The brain has no software. It has no programming. It has no CPU. It has no Pentium chip. It has no subroutines. The brain doesn't have any of the standard characteristics of a Turing machine or a digital computer. The brain is a very sophisticated neural network. It is a learning machine. It rewires the resistance of all its connections upon learning any task. And that's why for the last 50 years, I think we were on a wild goose chase trying to create a digital computer that can mimic the human brain. The human brain is a learning machine. It's quite different from a digital computer.
And the next step there is brought to us by the research of Dr. Norman Deutsch from the University of Toronto. And in a book called The Brain That Changes Itself, Dr. Deutsch speaks about what he calls neuroplasticity, and about the fact that in his view, the brain is not a machine at all, and it has to be understood on its own terms, because if you accept the idea of the brain as a machine of any kind, then that leads to what he calls neurological fatalism, which is not able to explain how the brain is actually able to grow and heal itself. And then he talks about the sort of the feedback loop between the thoughts that can actually change your brain, and also, of course, the brain changing your thoughts.
Well, I think the brain is a machine. It's a biological machine, very sophisticated, and we have not yet been able to even mimic a fraction of the capabilities of the brain. But I think the brain is a machine.
But does it have neuroplasticity?
Oh yeah, it can rewire itself. Neural networks change themselves all the time. The question is, does it have a soul? That's an additional question, okay? A biological machine may have a soul, and being a physicist, I say that all theories have to be tested, they have to be reproducible and falsifiable. So, if people believe in soul, then we have to measure it. And people have tried. When people die, scientists have tried to measure whether or not the weight of a body changes when you die. And we find no visible change. So, at a certain point, the idea of a soul is, in some sense, untestable. Not reproducible, not falsifiable. Not necessarily wrong, it just means it's outside the boundaries of science. And so, of course, the brain is a biological machine. It's a machine that rewires itself. It's a machine that is not a Turing machine. The brain is not a standard Turing machine. The brain has no programming. Where's the programming? Where's the Windows? Where's the operating system up there? There is none. Because it does one thing much better than any Turing machine, and that is it learns by rewiring itself. So the brain is a biological machine. The question is, does it have a soul? And my answer is, I don't know. I'm a physicist. I only work with things that are testable, falsifiable, and reproducible. And until someone can give me an experiment that allows me to test and reproduce and falsify a theory of soul, I'll say that the jury is out.